His name is still stamped on rifles you can buy today, yet the massive brick factory in New Haven that once produced them stands dark and silent, its machines cold since the guns moved overseas. Oliver Winchester built one of the greatest industrial empires of the 19th century without ever inventing a single thing. He bought other men's genius, then drove those geniuses away. The repeating rifle he sold armed a continent, made his family fabulously rich, and the legend says fabulously cursed. Over the next hour, we will trace how the gun that won the West outlived the company that made it, and how that company slowly destroyed itself. Oliver Fisher. Winchester knew almost nothing about firearms. He knew shirts. By the 1850s, he had built one of the most profitable men's clothing operations in the United States, patenting a new way to cut and sew the curved collar so it fit the human neck without binding, then manufacturing those shirts by the thousands in New Haven, Connecticut. He was a businessman of the new American type. He did not make things with his hands. He organized other men to make things, took a share of what they produced, and reinvested the profit wherever it would grow fastest. Guns were simply the next field he chose to plant. He came to them as a speculator, not a soldier or a smith. In 1855, a struggling concern called the Volcanic Repeating Arms Company was selling a clever, troubled idea, a lever-action pistol that fed cartridges from a tube beneath the barrel, firing several shots before reloading. The concept was decades ahead of its time. The execution was a disaster. The ammunition was weak, the mechanism temperamental, the company underfunded and badly run. Two of its founders were named Horace Smith and Daniel Wesson, men who would soon walk away to build a far more famous partnership of their own. Winchester saw past the failure to the principle, a repeating firearm, one that could deliver round after round without pause, would be worth more than any single-shot weapon ever made. He bought in. The Volcanic Company collapsed within 2 years. Winchester did not retreat. He did what men of capital do when an enterprise fails around them. He bought the wreckage. He acquired the assets, the patents, and the tooling, dissolved what remained, and in 1857 reorganized the whole operation under a new name, the New Haven Arms Company. He installed himself at its head. He owned the largest share, and he was, by any honest accounting, a clothing manufacturer presiding over a gun factory he could not have operated for a single afternoon on his own. A man who buys genius instead of possessing it is bound by a single dependency. He must keep finding it, recognizing it, and holding on to it. Winchester had capital and ambition in abundance. What he did not have was the one thing that would actually make his rifles work, the mechanical brilliance to solve the problems that had killed Volcanic. He needed a craftsman who could take a beautiful, broken idea and make it deadly. He found one already inside his own factory. His name was Benjamin Tyler Henry. He was a New Englander, a master mechanic, and gunsmith who had spent his working life around precision metal, a quiet, exacting man who understood firearms in a way Winchester never would. Henry had been hired as plant superintendent, and he looked at the failing Volcanic system the way a surgeon looks at a patient who is dying of something curable. The pistol's fatal weakness was its cartridge. The self-contained rounds were too feeble to be reliable, too underpowered to matter in a fight. Fix the ammunition, Henry understood, and the entire concept came alive. So he did. Over several years of patient work, Henry developed a far more powerful self-contained metallic cartridge, a .44 caliber rimfire round that carried real weight and real velocity. Then he redesigned the rifle around it. He reworked the action, the feeding system, the loading, every component that had failed before, until he had something no army on earth could yet match. In 1860, he patented it. The weapon bore his name. They called it the Henry Rifle. Picture the thing itself. A lever-action repeater with a brass frame, a 16-shot tube magazine running the length of the barrel, capable of firing as fast as a man could work the lever and pull the trigger, in an era when soldiers carried single-shot muzzle loaders, ramming powder and ball down the barrel before every shot, kneeling, exposed, slow. The Henry could empty 16 rounds in under 30 seconds. It was not an improvement on existing weapons. It was a different category of weapon. A man with a Henry was worth a squad of men with muskets, and everyone who fired one understood it instantly. And here is the contradiction sitting at the foundation of the entire empire. The rifle that would make Oliver Winchester's name immortal was not designed by Oliver Winchester. It was designed by an employee. The cartridge that made it work, the action that made it reliable, the engineering that turned a failed novelty into the most advanced firearm in the world, all of it came from Benjamin Tyler Henry's hands and Henry's mind. Winchester's contribution was money, organization, and the conviction to keep funding the work when a more cautious man would have cut his losses. Those contributions were real. They were also not the rifle. The most important thing in the company belonged, by every measure that mattered to the men who built it, to someone other than the man whose name was on the door. The New Haven Arms Company began producing the Henry rifle in 1862, and the timing could not have been more fateful. The United States had torn itself apart. The Civil War was consuming men and material at a rate no one had imagined, and a weapon that let one soldier do the work of many was about to find the largest, most desperate market in the world. But the company was small, its output limited, its rifle expensive. The federal government, conservative and overwhelmed, was slow to adopt anything so radical and so costly. Official orders trickled where they should have flooded, yet the rifle sold anyway, because the men who would carry it understood its value better than the bureaucrats who refused to buy it. Soldiers spent their own pay, sometimes a substantial fraction of it, to put a Henry in their hands rather than trust the muzzle loader their government issued them. They wrote home about it. They wrote to the company about it. Word spread through the ranks and across the lines the way only a battlefield truth can spread, soldier to soldier, in the simple currency of who lived and who did not. The reputation that formed in those years would outlast the war, outlast the men, and outlast the company itself. The Henry was becoming a legend while it was still being made. And underneath the legend, mostly unseen, the structure of the future was already setting into place. A businessman at the top who owned the name and the profit. A craftsman below him who owned the genius and the patent. A rifle whose fame was beginning to eclipse everyone connected to it. And a market, vast and bloody and hungry, that was about to make all of them rich. None of it was stable. A company built on one man's design, controlled by another man's money, depends entirely on those two men wanting the same things. For a while they did. The rifle worked, the orders came, the reputation grew, and there was enough success to paper over the question of who truly owned what. But the question did not go away. It waited. Benjamin Tyler Henry had given the company everything that made it worth anything, and he was beginning to feel the weight of what that meant, beginning to ask what his genius was actually worth to the man who had merely paid for it. That reckoning was coming. The war was not yet over, the rifle was not yet famous nationwide, and the name Winchester had not yet been stamped on a single gun. But the fracture was already there in the foundation, hairline thin, invisible to outsiders, structural all the same. Everything that rose from this place would rise from a partnership that could not hold. The Confederate soldiers who faced it gave it the name that stuck. That damned Yankee rifle, they said, that you load on Sunday and shoot all week. It was a soldier's joke with a soldier's respect buried inside it. A man behind a Henry did not stop to reload while you closed the distance. He simply kept firing, Lever and trigger, lever and trigger. A wall of lead where there should have been a pause. Units that carried Henrys in numbers could hold positions that should have been overrun, could break charges that should have succeeded. The rifle did not just kill, it rearranged the arithmetic of a fight. There is a story, often told, of a single regiment of Union soldiers armed with Henrys at their own expense, cutting down wave after wave of attackers and walking away convinced the weapon had saved their lives. Whether every detail of every such account is exact hardly matters. What matters is that the men believed it, and their belief was earned in the only laboratory that counts. The Henry's reputation was not manufactured in an advertisement. It was written in the field, by the people most qualified to judge it, in the years when being wrong about a rifle meant dying. By the end of the war, the New Haven Arms Company had a legend on its hands, and a problem in its foundation. The legend was the rifle. The problem was the man who had made it. Because while Oliver Winchester had been building a market, Benjamin Tyler Henry had been building a grievance. He held the patent. His name was on the gun. And he had watched the company grow on the strength of his invention while feeling, with mounting bitterness, that he was not being rewarded in proportion to what he had given. A partnership between the man with the money and the man with the genius holds on one condition only. It works as long as the genius believes he is being treated fairly. Henry did not. In the closing years of the war and just after, with Winchester frequently away tending other interests, Henry made his move. He petitioned the Connecticut legislature to change the name of the company to his own, and in effect, to wrest control of the enterprise from the man who had financed it. He had the patent as his leverage. He believed the rifle was his, and so the company should be his. It was a serious threat, and Winchester treated it as one. What he did next revealed the kind of businessman he truly was, because it was not the move of a manufacturer. It was the move of a strategist who understood that ownership of an idea and ownership of a company are two different things, and that the second could be defended even when the first was contested. While Henry maneuvered through the legislature, Winchester maneuvered around him entirely. He reorganized. In 1866, Oliver Winchester dissolved the New Haven Arms Company and incorporated a new entity under a name no legislature could hand to anyone else. He called it the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. He moved the operation, secured the assets, and structured the new firm so that control rested firmly and unambiguously with him. Henry was outflanked. His patent covered the old rifle, but the company that would carry the technology forward now bore the Winchester name and answered to Winchester's authority. The craftsman had reached for the enterprise and closed his hand on the original gun, while the empire walked away under another man's banner. Benjamin Tyler Henry, the mechanical genius who had taken a failed novelty and made it the most advanced firearm in the world, was effectively pushed to the margins of the company his work had created. He kept his name on the rifle that bore it. He did not keep the future. The man who could not build a gun had outmaneuvered the man who could, and the lesson sat there at the founding of the empire for anyone willing to read it. In this company, genius was a thing you hired, used, and if it grew troublesome, removed. The name on the building would always belong to the man who controlled the money. And the very first product of the new Winchester Repeating Arms Company proved the point in steel. Henry's rifle had a flaw, a serious one. It loaded through the front of the magazine tube, an awkward arrangement that exposed the spring to dirt and made the weapon vulnerable to fouling. A company engineer named Nelson King solved it, designing a loading gate set into the side of the receiver, so cartridges could be pushed in cleanly from the side, faster and far more reliably. The improvement was elegant and important, and it transformed the gun. The result, introduced in 1866, was the first rifle to carry the Winchester name. Officially the Model 1866, it was known to everyone who saw it by a simpler, fonder title. The brass alloy of its frame gave it a warm golden glow in sunlight, and so they called it the Yellow Boy. It was a Henry rifle made whole, the 16-shot repeating power refined and made dependable, wrapped in a frame that gleamed like something precious. It was beautiful, and it worked, and it sold. It sold not only to Americans, but to the world. Foreign governments, frontier settlers, hunters, and fighters of every description wanted the repeating rifle from New Haven. The Yellow Boy went to the plains of the American West and to the armies of distant nations, and everywhere it went, it carried the name of a Connecticut shirt manufacturer who had never designed a firearm in his life. Oliver Winchester had what he wanted at last, a company that was entirely his, a rifle that bore only his name, a reputation inherited from Henry's genius and King's refinement that now belonged to the brand rather than to any single man. And the money began to arrive in earnest. Each rifle sold was profit layered on profit, and the profit was making the Winchester family wealthy at a speed that few American fortunes had ever matched. The company that had nearly been handed to its own inventor was instead becoming the foundation of a dynasty. Within a generation, the Winchesters would stand among the richest families in the country, their names synonymous with the repeating rifle, their fortune built on a stream of weapons flowing out of New Haven to every corner of a violent century. No one yet imagined that such a fortune could carry a shadow, that wealth drawn from a machine built to kill might one day feel, to those who inherited it, less like a blessing than a debt that could never be paid. That was years away, a private grief waiting in the future. For now, there was only a cent. The Yellow Boy had announced the company to the world, and the world had answered with orders. But the Model 1866, for all its success, was a refinement of an old idea, a perfected version of the rifle Henry had built in the middle of a war. The weapon that would carry the Winchester name into legend, the gun that an entire mythology of the American West would be built upon, had not yet been made. It was coming, and when it arrived, it would not merely sell, it would conquer. It arrived in 1873, and it changed everything. The Model 1873 was, on paper, another refinement, an iron frame replacing the brass, a stronger action, a more powerful cartridge. But the sum of those changes was a weapon so well balanced, so reliable, so perfectly suited to its moment, that it stopped being merely a product and became an instrument of history. Winchester had built the rifle that the American West did not yet know it was waiting for. Within a few years, it would be impossible to picture the frontier without it. The genius of the 1873 was partly mechanical and partly a single shrewd decision about ammunition. The rifle was chambered for a new cartridge, the .4440, and that cartridge did something no rifle round had done before. It matched the revolver. Colt soon chambered its famous single-action Army pistol for the very same .44-40, which meant a man riding the plains could carry one box of cartridges and feed both his rifle and his sidearm from it. On the frontier, where a wagon resupply might be weeks away and a mistake about ammunition could be fatal, this was not a convenience. It was survival. The Winchester rifle and the Colt revolver became the paired tools of an entire era, and they sold each other. Here's the thing about the phrase that would define the gun. They called it the rifle that won the West. And like all the best legends, it was both an exaggeration and a deep truth. The West was not won by a rifle. It was taken, settled, fought over, and transformed by people. And the cost of that transformation fell heaviest on those who were already there. But the Winchester was in the hands of nearly all of them, on every side of every line, And that ubiquity is what the phrase really records. Consider who actually carried it. Ranchers and cattlemen kept Winchesters in their saddle scabbards against rustlers, predators, and the simple emergencies of distance. Lawmen carried them to bring order, or something resembling order, to towns that had outrun the reach of any court. The outlaws those lawmen hunted carried the identical rifle, because the gun did not care about the morality of the hand that worked its lever. Homesteaders kept one behind the cabin door. The United States Army used them, and native nations, fighting to hold the last of their land against a tide of settlement, armed themselves with Winchesters wherever they could obtain them, and used them with a skill that their enemies remembered with respect and fear. The rifle was on every side of the conflict because it was simply the best tool for the work, and the work was everywhere. This universality made the Winchester something larger than a commercial success. It became a piece of the American imagination, and the company understood, perhaps better than any manufacturer before it, that a legend could be cultivated as deliberately as a crop. The marketing of the Winchester was as innovative as the engineering. The company did not merely sell rifles, it sold the idea of the rifle, the romance of it, the sense that to hold a Winchester was to hold a piece of the frontier itself. The instruments of that legend were the great showmen of the age. Buffalo Bill Cody, the scout-turned-impresario, built a touring spectacle called the Wild West that carried a mythologized frontier to audiences across America and Europe, and the Winchester was woven through it. And then there was Annie Oakley, the finest exhibition shooter the world had ever seen, a small woman from Ohio who could shatter glass balls tossed in the air, snuff candles, and split a playing card edge-on, performing feats of marksmanship that left crowds gasping. When audiences saw what could be done with a rifle in expert hands, the rifle they saw was often a Winchester. The skill belonged to Oakley. The association belonged to the company. Even the rising politicians of the age lent the gun their prestige. Theodore Roosevelt, the asthmatic New York patrician who remade himself into a Dakota rancher and big-game hunter, became a devoted admirer of the lever-action Winchester, praising it in his popular writings about the strenuous outdoor life. When a future president of the United States told the reading public that the Winchester was the rifle he trusted in the wilderness, no advertisement the company could have purchased would have been worth as much. The brand was becoming inseparable from a certain image of American manhood, courage, and competence. And the money followed the myth. Picture New Haven in these years. The Winchester Repeating Arms Company had grown from a modest operation into a sprawling industrial complex, its buildings multiplying along the streets, its workforce swelling into the thousands, the sound of its machinery a constant presence in the city. It was becoming a company town in the truest sense, an enterprise around which an entire community organized its labor, its wages, and its future. The rifles flowed out by the tens of thousands, and the wealth flowed back in. That wealth made the Winchesters one of the richest families in America, their fortune now vast enough to seem permanent, a thing that would simply go on, producing itself forever. But fortunes built on a single brilliant product carry a hidden anxiety, the knowledge that the product must be defended, improved, and replaced before a competitor does it for you. And there was a private cost too, one that would not become visible for years. Sarah Winchester, the wife of Oliver's son William, would one day inherit a share of all this, and she would come to believe that a fortune drawn from a weapon of such lethal genius could not be held without consequence. That belief, and what it would drive her to build, lay still in the future. For now there was only the rifle, the legend, and the gold. To keep the empire growing, Winchester did what it had always done. It broadened the line. The Model 1873 was joined in the very same year by a larger, more powerful companion, the Model 1876. sometimes called the Centennial in honor of the nation's 100th birthday. It was built on a beefed-up version of the 1873's Action, designed to handle the heavier, longer cartridges that serious big-game hunting and military use demanded. Roosevelt favored it. So did the famous Northwest Mounted Police of Canada, who adopted it for service on their own frontier. The 1876 extended the Winchester name into territory the lighter rifle could not reach, proving the company could scale its design upward as the market demanded. Yet the 1876 also exposed a limit. Its action, enlarged from the original toggle link design Henry had pioneered, was reaching the edge of what that mechanism could safely handle. To chamber the truly powerful cartridges, the ones used by the great single-shot hunting rifles and by armies around the world, Winchester would need an entirely new action, stronger and more advanced than anything its own engineers had yet produced. The company that had grown rich on borrowed genius was about to need genius again, and once more, it would not come from within. It would walk through the door from the outside, in the person of a young man from Utah whose mechanical gifts would surpass even Henry's, and who would carry the Winchester name to its absolute peak before history turned. By the 1880s, the Winchester Repeating Arms Company had become something the young New Haven arms operation could never have imagined. Walk through New Haven in this decade and the company was simply everywhere. Its factory buildings sprawled across acres, brick and iron and glass, a small city of production that ran day and night. Thousands of workers passed through its gates, machinists and assemblers and inspectors, drawn from New Haven and from the waves of immigrants arriving in industrial America. The company did not merely employ them. It set the rhythm of their lives, the wages they spent, the houses they rented, the future they imagined for their children. To work at Winchester was to belong to one of the great industrial enterprises of the age, and the rifles were only part of it. The legend of the West tends to forget the other half of the Winchester empire. The company that sold guns also sold the thing that fed them, and that second business grew into a giant of its own. Every Winchester rifle in the world consumed cartridges, and Winchester made the cartridges by the millions and then the hundreds of millions. Its ammunition division became one of the largest in the United States, a manufacturing operation of staggering scale, turning out rimfire and centerfire rounds for its own rifles and for countless other weapons besides. The genius of the 4440 had taught the company a permanent lesson. The gun sold the ammunition, and the ammunition sold forever. A rifle was bought once. Its cartridges were bought for a lifetime. This was vertical power of a kind few manufacturers possessed. Winchester controlled the weapon and its appetite, the tool and its fuel, and the worldwide catalog that carried both. Its products reached across oceans to military contracts and trading posts and sporting outfitters on every continent. The name stamped on a New Haven rifle had become one of the most recognized industrial marks on Earth, a symbol of American manufacturing reach. The company that a craftsman had nearly seized for himself in 1866 was now an institution, seemingly beyond the power of any one man to make or break. But an institution still needs invention to survive, and the limits of the old toggle link action had not gone away. Winchester needed a designer who could carry the company past the boundaries its own engineers had reached. In the early 1880s it found him, and he was the most gifted firearms inventor who would ever live. His name was John Moses Browning. He was a young man from Ogden, Utah, raised in his father's gunsmith shop, largely self-taught. Possessed of a mechanical imagination so fluid and so prolific that it seems even now almost difficult to credit. Browning did not labor toward designs the way other men did. He seemed to pull them out of the air, complete, one after another, year after year, as though firearms were a language he had been born already speaking. Winchester discovered him when one of his early single-shot rifle designs came to the company's attention, and the men in New Haven understood at once what they were looking at. They bought it. It became the Winchester Model 1885, a single-shot rifle of such strength and elegance that target shooters prized it for generations. It was the beginning of the most productive partnership in the history of American firearms. Over roughly the next 2 decades, Browning became the secret engine of the Winchester Golden Age, supplying the company with a stream of designs that defined the lever-action rifle for all time. He gave Winchester the Model 1886, a lever action of immense strength that could finally chamber the most powerful cartridges of the day, solving the exact problem the old action could not. He gave it the Model 1892, a light, fast, graceful lever gun that became one of the most beloved rifles ever made and would later arm 1,000 Hollywood westerns. He gave it the Model 1894. The Model 1894 deserves its own breath because it became the single best-selling sporting rifle in the history of the world, chambered eventually for the new smokeless powder cartridge, the .30-30. It was light, reliable, affordable, and perfectly suited to the deer hunter and the rancher and the ordinary American who wanted one good rifle for a lifetime. It sold in the millions upon millions, decade after decade, long outliving every man involved in its creation. If any single object deserves to be called the rifle in the American closet, the gun, behind the kitchen door across a century of the nation's life, it is Browning's Model 1894, wearing the Winchester name. And he was not finished. Browning gave Winchester the Model 1897 shotgun, a pump-action design so rugged and effective that it would still be fighting in the trenches of the First World War 2 decades later, where troops used it to such devastating effect that the enemy formally protested its use. Each of these designs was a triumph. Together they formed the backbone of the Winchester catalog at the height of its power and prestige. The company sold them as Winchesters, stamped with the Winchester name, woven into the Winchester legend. And the man who had actually conceived them remained, to the buying public, almost invisible. This was the arrangement that made the Golden Age golden. Winchester paid Browning for his designs, manufactured them at tremendous scale, and reaped the profit and the glory. Browning, for his part, was generously compensated and free to keep inventing. And for many years the relationship suited both sides. The richest firearms company in America had married the greatest firearms mind in America. And the offspring of that union was a line of weapons that has never been equaled. It was, by every visible measure, a perfect partnership at the summit of an industry. Yet there was something in the structure of it that echoed the founding. Something that should have whispered a warning to anyone who remembered Benjamin Tyler Henry. Once again, the genius stood outside the walls of his own achievement. Once again, the company owned the name, while another man owned the gift. And Browning, unlike Henry, was not an employee who could be outmaneuvered through a clever reincorporation. He was an independent inventor who sold his designs by contract, and that independence gave him a freedom Henry had never possessed. So long as Winchester gave him what he wanted, the arrangement held. There was a quiet habit forming inside the company too, easy to miss in the glow of so much success. Not every design Browning brought to New Haven was put into production. Winchester bought some of them simply to keep them, paying for the rights and then setting the drawings aside, unwilling to let a rival have them, and unwilling to disturb the rifles already selling so well. For now it looked like ordinary prudence, the caution of a market leader protecting its position. It was the small, fateful seed of the break to come. That quiet habit deserves a closer look because it reveals what Winchester had truly become. The company bought Browning designs it never intended to build. It paid real money for inventions and then locked the drawings away, not to use them, but to bury them, ensuring no competitor could. From a certain angle, this was simply shrewd. A market leader defends its territory, and the surest way to keep a rival from selling a better gun is to own the better gun and decline to make it. But look at what it meant. Winchester was no longer a company hungry for the next great weapon. It was a company protecting the weapons it already sold. The Model 1894 and its companions were earning fortunes, and any radically new design, however brilliant, threatened to compete with the rifles already filling the company's order books. Success had made Winchester cautious. The enterprise that had once gambled everything on a failed novelty now spent its money to keep new ideas off the market. The genius it had hired was being used, in part, to stand still. Here's the thing about telling the most creative man in your industry, that his ideas are valuable mainly as things to suppress. Sooner or later, he will bring you an idea too important to bury, and then you will have to choose. Winchester reached that moment at the turn of the century, and the idea was the future of firearms itself. By 1900, John Browning had moved beyond the lever and the pump. He had been working for years on the principle that would define modern weapons, the use of a cartridge's own energy to load the next round automatically, self-loading, auto-loading, the gun that fired and reloaded itself as fast as the shooter could pull the trigger. He had already begun applying it to the machine guns that would make his name immortal in military history. And now he had turned it to the sporting world. He brought Winchester a design for a semi-automatic shotgun, a weapon that would empty its magazine as fast as a finger could work, with no lever, no pump, no manual motion at all. It was the most important sporting firearm anyone had conceived in a generation, and Browning knew it. He also decided this time to change the terms. For nearly 20 years, Browning had sold his designs to Winchester the same way: an outright purchase, a lump sum, the company paying once and owning the design forever. It had made Winchester rich beyond measure and left Browning, though well paid, without a share in the fortunes his inventions generated. For the automatic shotgun, the masterwork, he asked for something different. He asked for a royalty. He wanted to be paid for each gun sold, a continuing stake in the success of his own creation. It was, by any modern standard, an entirely reasonable request from the man whose mind had built the company's catalog. The president of Winchester was then Thomas Gray Bennett, Oliver Winchester's son-in-law, the man who had personally recruited Browning 2 decades earlier and presided over the golden years their partnership produced. And Bennett said no. The company had never paid a royalty to an inventor, and he would not begin now, not even for this. To grant Browning a percentage was to admit that the indispensable genius of the enterprise lived outside its walls, to surrender a portion of Winchester's profits and Winchester's control to a contractor from Utah. Bennett would pay a fortune in a single sum, as the company always had. He would not share the future. Browning did not argue for long. He had spent his life watching companies grow rich on his mind while treating him as a vendor, and he had finally built something that gave him the leverage to refuse. According to the account that has come down through firearms history, he simply gathered his design and walked out of the New Haven office, where he had brought triumph after triumph, and he never sold Winchester another gun. The partnership that had defined the Golden Age ended not in a lawsuit or a scandal, but in a single conversation about money and respect, and a quiet refusal on both sides to bend. Let that sink in. The most valuable relationship in the history of the company, the source of the rifles and shotguns that were its very identity, was severed because Winchester would not pay a percentage to the man who made it all. The same instinct that had pushed Henry to the margins in 1866, the determination that the name and the money would always outrank the genius, had now driven away the greatest designer who would ever live. The company had done it again, only this time the man it lost did not fade into obscurity. He took the future with him. Browning carried his automatic shotgun across the Atlantic. He offered it to the Belgian firm Fabrique Nationale in the city of Liège, and FN seized it without hesitation, royalty, and all. The gun went into production as the Browning Auto 5, and it became one of the most successful and influential shotguns ever made, manufactured for nearly a century, copied around the world, the foundation of an entirely new category of weapon. Every one of them was sold by someone other than Winchester. The profits, the prestige, the technological lead into the automatic age, all of it flowed to a company in Belgium, because a company in Connecticut would not share. The break did more than cost Winchester a single product. It cost the company the man who would go on to design the firearms that defined the 20th century, the pistols and machine guns and automatic rifles that armies would carry through 2 world wars. Winchester had held the future in its hands, in the person of John Browning, and had let it walk out the door over a question of royalties. The decision was not stupid in the narrow sense. It protected the company's existing profits and its existing control, exactly as intended. It was merely fatal in the long sense, the kind of victory that wins the argument and loses the century. And the strangest part is that the loss was invisible at first. Winchester remained enormous, rich, and dominant. The rifles kept selling. The ammunition kept flowing. The name still meant what it had always meant. A great company can coast for a long time on the momentum of past genius. And Winchester now began to coast, no longer creating the future, but living off what it had already built. The decline, when the historians later traced it, would begin here, in this room, with this refusal. But no one in New Haven felt the ground shift. They had simply said no to an inventor's fee, as they always had, and gone back to the business of being the most famous gun company in the world. The reckoning would wait for a war. The war came in 1914, and for a moment it seemed to vindicate everything about the way Winchester did business. Europe had set itself on fire, and the combatants needed weapons in quantities that staggered the imagination. Britain and its allies came to New Haven with contracts of a scale the company had never seen, orders for rifles by the hundreds of thousands, for ammunition by the hundreds of millions of rounds. When the United States entered the conflict in 1917, the federal appetite swelled the books further still. Winchester took the contracts, all of them, and then set about building the capacity to fill them. Picture what happened to New Haven. The company borrowed enormous sums and poured the money into expansion, throwing up new buildings, installing new machinery, multiplying its floor space until the plant had grown to a size that would have been unrecognizable a few years before. The workforce exploded. Where thousands had worked, now many more thousands poured through the gates, hired in haste to meet a demand that seemed bottomless. The factory ran around the clock, consuming steel and coal and labor, producing weapons for a war an ocean away. On paper, the company was booming as never before. In truth, it was loading a gun and pressing the muzzle to its own chest. An empire built on wartime demand carries a flaw in its foundation. The demand ends when the war ends, and it ends all at once. The expansion was financed with debt, mountains of it, borrowed against the assumption that the orders would continue long enough to pay for the plant that filled them. But wars do not file notice before they stop. In November 1918, the armistice was signed, and the guns of Europe fell silent, and with them fell the orders that had justified everything Winchester had borrowed. Overnight, the contracts evaporated. The vast new factory, built for a war that no longer existed, stood half idle. And the debt remained, enormous, unforgiving, due. The company now faced a problem it had created for itself. It had borrowed to build capacity that the peace had rendered useless, and it needed desperately something to manufacture in those silent buildings and some way to service the debt that had built them. the leadership made a fateful decision. If the world no longer needed Winchester's weapons in such quantity, then Winchester would sell the world everything else. The company would take the most trusted name in American hardware and stamp it on a vast catalog of ordinary consumer goods, turning the idle plant to peaceful production and the famous brand to general retail. And so, the Winchester name, which had meant the rifle that won the West, began to appear on things no frontiersman would have recognized. Winchester kitchen knives and pocket cutlery, Winchester flashlights and batteries, Winchester fishing tackle and pocket knives and razors, Winchester roller skates, Winchester refrigerators, washing machines, household tools of every description, a sprawling line of hardware store merchandise sold through a national chain of Winchester retail stores. The company that had armed a continent was now selling ice skates and egg beaters under the same proud name. Let that sink in. The most storied weapons manufacturer in American history, the maker of the gun that built a national mythology, was reduced to hawking flashlights and frying pans to service the debt of a war that had ended. The diversification was not insane on its face. The brand was genuinely beloved, and the logic of using it more broadly had a surface appeal. But it scattered the company's focus, demanded expertise in dozens of trades it did not possess, forced it to compete with established hardware makers on their own ground, and drowned its identity in a flood of merchandise that had nothing to do with what Winchester actually was. The rifle had been a masterpiece. The roller skates were just roller skates. The venture consumed capital and returned little. Through the 1920s, the company poured effort into its consumer empire and watched it underperform, the retail stores struggling, the hardware lines failing to generate the profits the debt demanded. The famous name, it turned out, could not make a mediocre kitchen knife sell like a magnificent rifle. The genius that had built Winchester had always lived in its weapons, and the weapons were exactly what this strategy pushed to the margins. The company was trying to escape its debt by becoming something other than itself, and it was not working. And there is, threaded through these years, a stranger and sadder Winchester story, one that had begun decades earlier and now ran its course far from New Haven. Sarah Winchester, widow of Oliver's son William, had inherited an enormous share of the rifle fortune along with, the legend holds, a terrible conviction. The story passed down is that a medium told the grieving widow her family was haunted by the spirits of all those killed by the Winchester rifle, and that only ceaseless building could appease them. Whether she truly believed this, or whether the tale grew in the telling, no one can now say with certainty. What is certain is the house. In California, Sarah Winchester bought a modest farmhouse, and then never stopped building onto it. Year after year, decade after decade, carpenters working in shifts around the clock. The result was an architectural labyrinth of extraordinary strangeness, with staircases that climbed into ceilings, doors that opened onto blank walls or sheer drops, hallways that led nowhere, rooms built and then sealed away. By her death, the mansion had sprawled into scores of rooms, a maze with no plan and no purpose but the building itself. It stands today as a tourist attraction, and whatever the truth of the curse, it remains the most haunting monument the rifle fortune ever produced, a fortune so vast it could fund a lifetime of building toward nothing. Back in New Haven, there was no medium to blame, only a balance sheet. The consumer gamble had failed to lift the debt. And the company entered the new decade weakened, unfocused, and dangerously overextended. Then the wider world delivered the blow that overextended companies cannot survive. In October 1929, the stock market collapsed, and the Great Depression closed over the American economy like water over a stone. Consumer spending, the very thing Winchester had bet its future on, dried up. The hardware lines that were already failing now collapsed entirely. The weapons business slumped with everything else. The debt did not care. The company that had survived the rise and fall of the frontier, that had armed nations and outlived its own founders, could not survive its arithmetic. The borrowing of the war years, the failure of the consumer empire, and the crushing weight of the Depression converged into a single, inescapable conclusion. By the early 1930s, Winchester was insolvent, its obligations beyond any hope of payment, its proud independence finished. In 1931, the Winchester Repeating Arms Company went into receivership, the empire that Oliver Winchester had built from borrowed genius and a shirtmaker's ambition, that had stood as one of the great names of American industry for 65 years, had run out of money and out of time. What came next would not be rescue by its own hand. It would be rescue by another. The rescue came from the world of ammunition. The Western Cartridge Company, a successful and well-managed firm led by the Olin family, acquired the bankrupt Winchester operation in 1931, drawn by the value that survived the wreckage, the legendary name and the manufacturing capacity behind it. The Olins were industrialists of a sober, disciplined kind, the sort of management Winchester had never truly had at the top. They pruned the failed consumer lines, refocused the company on what it knew, and steadied the foundering enterprise. Winchester would make guns and ammunition again. The empire was no longer independent, but it would survive. And then, once more, a war remade its fortunes. When the Second World War engulfed the world, the United States again needed weapons at a scale only its great arms makers could provide, and Winchester answered as it had a generation before. This time the company did more than fill orders. It contributed real design work to the nation's arsenal, and in doing so, it produced one last echo of the pattern that had haunted it from the beginning. The weapon was the M1 carbine, a light, handy, semi-automatic rifle that American forces would carry by the millions. Winchester built it in vast numbers and had a genuine hand in shaping it. But the heart of its mechanism, the short-stroke gas piston that made the little gun work, came from the mind of an outsider, a self-taught designer named David Marshall Williams, a man who had reportedly begun developing his ideas while serving time in a southern prison. Here's the kicker. At the very last height of its weapons-making life, in its finest contribution to its country, Winchester once again rode the genius of a man from outside its walls, Henry Browning Williams. 3 times the indispensable spark came from elsewhere. Only this time the company managed to keep it long enough to matter. The war years were a second golden age of production, the plant running flat out, the workforce swollen again, the Winchester name once more stamped on the weapons of a nation at arms. Had the story ended there, it might have ended in triumph. But the demand was wartime demand, and the pattern of 1918 reasserted itself in slower motion. When peace returned, the contracts shrank, and Winchester settled into the long post-war decline of an aging manufacturer competing in a changed market. The most painful wound of those later years the company inflicted on itself, and it came in 1964. Facing rising labor costs and cheaper competition, Winchester redesigned its most storied rifles, the Model 70 and the Model 94, to make them faster and less expensive to produce. Machined steel gave way to stamped parts and cost-cutting shortcuts. The new guns functioned, but the old craftsmanship, the fit and finish that had made a Winchester feel like a Winchester, was gone. Collectors and riflemen recognized the loss instantly. To this day, the phrase pre-64 is spoken with reverence, a way of dividing the rifles made when the company still cared about the old standards from everything that came after. It had hollowed out the very quality that was its name. From there, the decline was long and grinding. The original Winchester Repeating Arms Company faded into corporate history. In 1981, the Olin interests sold the firearms business to its own employees, who operated it as the U.S. Repeating Arms Company. But the new venture struggled, passed through bankruptcies, and eventually fell under foreign ownership. The Winchester name licensed to the Belgian conglomerate that had grown from the very firm John Browning enriched when New Haven turned him away. The rifles still bore the name. The independence, the ownership, the meaning had drained away by degrees. The end of New Haven came in 2006. After nearly a century and a half of continuous production, the great factory where the gun that won the West had been born closed its doors for good. The machines went quiet. The workers, the last in a line stretching back to the men who had built the Henry rifle in the middle of a civil war, went home. The Winchester name lives on today, stamped on rifles and shotguns made under license in other places, by other hands, in other countries. The brand survived. The company that gave it meaning did not. Walk through New Haven now and the buildings still stand in places, brick and silence where the machinery once roared, the windows dark along streets that an empire of arms once filled with the sound of its making. Somewhere a Model 1873 rests in a glass case, oiled and still, beneath a placard calling it the gun that won the West. And far away in California, a strange, unfinished mansion sprawls against the hills, its staircases climbing into ceilings, its doors opening onto air, built without end by a widow who could not stop. A rifle in a case, a factory gone quiet, a house that leads nowhere. The name endures on guns made elsewhere, and the rivers of the country it armed run on, indifferent, toward the sea.